When are nightmares just annoying, and when are they a symptom of something more? Now, as a neuroscientist and a nightmare sufferer myself, I can tell you that nightmares are not just bad dreams. So, bad dreams are like the negatively charged dreams. So, you wake up and you're like, well, I missed that final, I guess. Nightmares are dreams in which you are so kind of dysphoric, like you are so frightened and terrified, or angry or upset. They can have a variety of different emotions that you basically physically wake up from them, and you wake up feeling it that specific way. And you typically wake up at like the worst point of the nightmare too. And we know a lot of genuinely fascinating things about nightmares. So, for example, our brain is still processing the outside information. So, for example, in one of my more recent nightmares, basically someone forced me to chew on glass. And in that dream, I was just trying to pull glass out of my gums for the vast majority of it. And there, at the very end, there was a giant piece. But in that dream, I was probably processing the fact that like I also grind my teeth at night. And so that feeling of like tenseness, that was actually coming across in that nightmare. So you've probably had your alarms in your dreams. You might have had car horns. You might have had your cat throwing up. All of those are because your brain is still processing information and then kind of putting it into that story. So why do we have nightmares? Well, this is a more complicated question than you would think. So first, why do we dream? So one of the main theories as to why we dream is because we're basically like replaying scenarios during our sleep. So we're doing things like, let's figure out how to deal with this social situation, or let's remember this information from the French lecture that we were just learning today. Or things like, let's replay this potential threat and figure out how we should deal with it. And so that's one of the leading theories behind things like bad dreams. Like you are trying to process threat and to go through it in a way that's actually relatively safe for you. Instead of trying to figure out what would you do in a zombie apocalypse once that actually happens, you can just replay that scenario in your brain and try to figure it out before it might happen or before it does happen. So there might be kind of this benefit to having these dreams. You might be more prepared for these events in real life. And so nightmares are seemingly maybe just like a maladaptive version of that. So it's like a glitch, basically. Now, side note, pretty much all of this information that I'm talking about right now is coming from the book Nightmare Obscura, which I am genuinely obsessed with. The book is written by a sleep scientist who's actually studying nightmares, who, by the way, I think it would be incredibly cool to do research with like nightmares and sleep and how that relates to drug dreams, and if people are more likely to relapse after drug dreams, would love to do some sleep science there. Anyways, back to nightmares. If you think of nightmares as this kind of like maladaptive dream, it makes sense that it would be linked to other psychiatric disorders, and it is strongly linked to other psychiatric disorders. So for example, one of the symptoms of PTSD is actually having nightmares. So they say like that up to 90% of people with PTSD have nightmares. And most of their nightmares are what are known as replicative nightmares. So they're basically nightmares of just like reliving that specific trauma. Like it is a scene that is continuously replaying. Nightmares are one of the most like common symptoms of PTSD. They're a way that a lot of people can actually diagnose it. But we also see that nightmare disorder occurs in a lot of other types of psychiatric disorders as well. So first, there is something that is just called nightmare disorder, which is where you have nightmares. So you have these recurring, persistent bouts of having nightmares in which you wake up and they were like emotionally vivid and terrible. If you only have it like once a week, then it's a mild version. It can go up to the severe version, which is about once a night. And nightmare disorder is comorbid, so it is linked to a variety of other disorders. So there are the obvious ones like depression and anxiety. You see that people with nightmare disorder more often have things like depression and anxiety as well. And then you have things like non-suicidal self-injury. It's not just bad sleep that's linked to things like that. It is specifically the prevalence of nightmares. And we see that nightmare disorder is also positively correlated with things like borderline personality disorder. Now, positively correlated means that when one goes up, the other goes up as well. I'm going to force you to learn statistics through these videos too. And Michelle Carr also mentioned some other things that are strongly linked to having nightmares. So first, having sensory processing sensitivity. So if you're more sensitive to things like noises or textures, you might be more likely to have nightmares. And they're very specific. In a lot of cases, they're very vivid. Also, if you're high in neuroticism, so if you're more easily stressed, if you're high in that big 5 personality characteristic, you're more likely to have nightmares. And it's also linked to emotional dysregulation, which creates this kind of vicious cycle. So, what we see is that if you potentially have problems with emotional dysregulation, you're more likely to be stressed. And then, when you're more likely to be stressed, your brain is more likely to have nightmares. And when you're more likely to have nightmares, therefore, you're less likely to sleep well. And then you wake up after having a nightmare and you are then more stressed that next day. And so, you can see how this ends. And that made me curious about if there was a link with nightmares and ADHD as well, and there is. So you see that people with ADHD are more likely to have nightmare disorder, and in general, even children with ADHD are more likely to just have bad dreams. So negative emotions in their dreams that might not cause them to wake up or might not cause them to actually have those physical characteristics, but it's still unpleasant. So if you have nightmares, you know just how unpleasant they can be. And sometimes they're rare, but sometimes they're common and a symptom of a disorder, and sometimes they're linked to other disorders like PTSD. We're actually doing the science on developing better treatments for them, which is super exciting. So there have been studies that suggest that things like progressive muscle relaxation before bed could actually help decrease nightmares. And then there's things like lucid dreaming, and you can actually learn to lucid dream. That might help with nightmares too. And then there's things that you can do during the day, like visual imagery or actually changing the script of your nightmares. So basically kind of like reliving that nightmare and putting a positive spin on it. Now, as somebody who has like aphantasia, who can't really visualize things, that doesn't seem that great for me, but it could work for some other people. Don't discount your nightmares. Talk to your doctor or therapist about them if you're having frequent nightmares. They could be just a symptom that you're stressed, or they could be a symptom of something more. We don't necessarily think that dreams have these like universal meanings and symbolism behind them, but they are telling you about what you're thinking about that day or in that last week. So give them the credit where credit is due. Respect the nightmares.